People claim that you are a millionaire, and if so, you must be one of the youngest people on the planet. Are you truly a millionaire, if I may ask you a sarcastic question? No. Known as the Quiet Beatle, George Harrison was the first to speak up when Yoko Ono joined their world. He forewarned John. He went straight up to her, anticipated the end before anybody else did. Something finally snapped inside him during the Let It Be sessions. On January 10, 1969, he said 5 words and walked out after lunch. That brief farewell was crucial. George knew exactly who had contributed to the Beatles' demise and that they were done. On February 25, 1943, George Harrison was born in a little home at 12 Arnold Grove, Liverpool's Wavertree. The toilet was outside and there was only one coal fire in the house to combat the bitter cold. Although it made life difficult, that was typical for working-class families at the period. Bombings in World War II had left Liverpool itself damaged. Up until 1954, people like the Harrisons had to put up with rationing. Fuel, clothing, and food were valuable. George was raised in difficult circumstances, but rather than making him resentful, they taught him courage and humility that he carried with him for the rest of his life. His mother, Louise, brought something unique to that modest upbringing, even after he rose to become one of the world's most famous men. She developed a fascination with Indian culture while she was expecting George. Radio India was on when she tuned in. Louise offered George an early taste of something that might influence his future by letting him listen to the unusual and lovely sounds of sitars and tablas, which was uncommon in a town like Liverpool, where most people listen to Western music without realizing it. George had already been moved by the music and spirit of the East long before he met Ravi Shankar or visited India. His lifelong passion for Indian philosophy and meditation was sparked by his mother's interest. Everything changed during a casual bike ride when George was around 12 or 13. He heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel playing through an open window as he rode his bike by a neighbor's house. He was struck like lightning by the sound. Rock and roll seemed exciting and crazy. Music ceased to be merely background noise at that point. Suddenly, George saw a route out of poverty. He dreamed of a larger life, one full of guitars and adventure, after hearing that song. It was the catalyst that led him to pursue a career in music. From then on, he had little interest in school. He struggled academically at the Liverpool Institute. George was occupied with learning something more significant, even if his teachers would have noticed his failure. He immersed himself in Buddy Holly, Little Richard, and Carl Perkins' songs. He was attracted to Buddy Holly's deft guitar work, Little Richard's untamed energy, and Perkins' rockabilly twang. George was studying how to use 6 strings to create magic while other children were learning information by heart. He was not hindered by his low grades. They shoved him ahead. He saved up enough cash by the age of 14 to purchase his first guitar, a Zenith Acoustic. He learned to play by repeatedly listening to albums and mimicking what he heard. He had no fancy professors or lessons. Rather, he was determined. He played till his fingers ached, learning techniques and chords that would later enable him to alter the course of music. He wasn't merely a fantastic musician because of his teenage commitment. It gave him the confidence to experiment with new sounds, such as the sitar that no other rock musician was playing. Another life-altering incident occurred at the age of 14. At the Liverpool Institute, he got to know Paul McCartney. Paul was 15 years old. Their mutual appreciation of the new American rebellious music led to their friendship. George kept to himself and concentrated on the guitar. Paul was creative and gifted. They had a hope of an alternative future. Paul introduced George to John Lennon within a year, and that uncomplicated friendship turned into the beginning of a life-altering event. At the age of 15, George became the lead guitarist with the Quarrymen in March 1958. Although John Lennon founded the band, George contributed fresh talent and vigor. During a bus audition, he dazzled John by playing the challenging instrumental Raunchy. George was younger than the others, but his skill more than compensated for it. His presence influenced the band's sound and put them on the course to become the Beatles. Between 1960 and 1962, Hamburg, Germany served as the actual test. The band performed in gritty bars with boisterous crowds for hours every night, often for as long as 8 hours. They barely had enough money to eat and lived in cramped, windowless apartments below the theater. Although it was a harsh experience, it strengthened them. They became a tighter band and understood how to work a crowd. They were prepared for anything by the time they returned to Liverpool. Fans were taken aback by their decision in 1962. Their drummer, Pete Best, was fired. The group felt he didn't quite belong, but it wasn't an easy decision. They added Ringo Starr, who gave their music a fresh energy. The final piece of the puzzle was in place, and the iconic Fab Four was complete with Ringo on drums. America would never forget what happened on February 9, 1964. The Beatles altered the course of history when they took the stage at the Edie Sullivan Show. Ringo Starr, George Harrison, Paul McCartney, and John Lennon were no longer just four young Liverpool men. They turned into myths. 73 million people watched them that evening. That meant that over 60% of the TV in America were switched on to watch them. The nation had never witnessed such a large-scale television event. Then, although there were only 728 seats available, CBS received 50,000 ticket requests. The desire to be a part of history was strong. 5 songs were performed by the Beatles. The audience erupted when they sang, "I Want to Hold Your Hand." In the studio were even Vice President Richard Nixon's daughters. President Kennedy had died only months earlier, and the entire nation was still in shock. Joy was delivered by the Beatles. They offered hope. It was more than just music that evening. Something fresh was beginning. Nationwide, Beatlemania swept through the nation. The invasion by the British had started. The Beatles did something that no one else had ever done by April 4th, 1964. At the same time, they occupied the top 5 positions on the Billboard Hot 100 list. Can't Buy Me Love came in first. Twist and Shout came in second. She Loves You came in third. I Want to Hold Your Hand came in at number 4. Please Please Me was number 5. 34 Beatles songs appeared on the Hot 100 in that year alone. Number 1 was reached by 6 of them. Not only were they at the top of the singles chart, for Meet the Beatles and Introducing are 2 of their albums. The Beatles also held the top 2 spots on the album list. They owned half of America's top 10 tunes for a week. For nearly 60 years, no one came close. And it was during the streaming era in 2021 that someone eventually tied the record. The Beatles had achieved this through the sale of recordings. They weren't just well-liked, as that week demonstrated. They couldn't be stopped. Quiet Ones George Harrison discovered his voice in 1963. He wrote Don't Bother Me When Ill in a Bournemouth hotel room. He described it as a pretty bad tune, but to him it was everything. It demonstrated his writing ability. In the US, the song appeared on Meet the Beatles, and in the UK, with the Beatles. Compared to the songs of Lennon and McCartney, it had a distinct tone, moodier and darker. Despite being a tiny step, it gave George the confidence to continue writing. He would give the world something one day. And When My Guitar Sobs Softly. However, he found it difficult to be a member of the Beatles. His songs were consistently ignored. Harrison only has 2 or 3 tunes on albums. He had composed so many songs by the late 1960s that he showed hundreds of them to producer Phil Spector. Beatles records didn't include hits like Isn't It a Pity and All Things Must Pass. He got stuck. It was like being constipated, he claimed, waiting for his tunes to be heard. It got to be too much during the Let It Be sessions. He left. It was different when he returned. What he had long suppressed was ultimately revealed to the world in his 1970 album, All Things Must Pass. George stood out for many reasons than only his music. He heard the sitar for the first time in 1965 while filming Help. He found it fascinating. He purchased one and applied it to wood from Norway. Everything changed because of that music. The sitar made its debut in Western mainstream music. It had a fresh, enigmatic sound. It was imitated by several bands. Before long, you heard Sitters and Donovan, the Rolling Stones, and the Byrds tunes. George's inexpensive Oxford Street sitar rose to fame. It brought almost $53,000 at auction in 2024. A whole new musical realm had been made accessible by the sitar. George's life was further altered in 1966 when he met Ravi Shankar. George was a Liverpool rock star. An esteemed Indian master was Ravi. Despite coming from separate worlds, they had a strong bond. George's commitment to learning was evident to Ravi. George witnessed Ravi's wisdom and spirituality. At late, George desired to relocate to India and pursue full-time education there. Few outsiders had ever been able to swiftly become Ravi's student. Together, they visited India. George discovered that it would require years of consistent practice to become proficient on the sitar, but they became closer. He learned about the soul, life, and music from Ravi. George took the Beatles to India in 1968. In order to practice transcendental meditation, they stayed at an ashram in Rishikesh. Peace was what they want. They sought clarification. In a matter of weeks, they wrote 48 songs there. However, tension began to build. Lennon grew agitated. They were worn out by the rigid regimen. They were at their most creative on the trip, but it was also the beginning of the band's demise. Then the scandal broke out. They were educated by the Maharishi, who was accused of approaching women at the ashram. Lennon was enraged. "What have you done, Maharishi?" he wrote. Hurt and furious, they left India. The song was retitled Sexy Sadie by Lennon. George was conflicted. Despite his disillusionment, he continued to believe in meditation. The band was indelibly altered by the experience. George delved further into Krishna consciousness after India. Every day he chanted Hare Krishna. He made the chant more widely known. Hare Krishna mantra, which he produced in 1969, peaked at number 12 in the UK. My Sweet Lord, one of his hits, was a prayer. Millions were donated to the Krishna movement by him. In the Beatles, George Harrison had always been the quiet one, but in 1968, he took a risk that completely altered the band's dynamic. While My Guitar Gently Weeps is a song he penned. After reading the I Ching, he had the idea. He was depressed at the friction within the Beatles and the absence of love in the world. He thought his songs were not taken seriously. He then took a startling action. Superstar guitarist and close friend Eric Clapton was asked to play lead guitar on the song. On their records, the Beatles hardly ever allow outside music. However, Clapton's presence forced Paul McCartney and John Lennon to pay attention this time. The studio's vibe shifted. Recorded in September 1968, the song turned into a masterpiece. Harrison's eerie lyrics and Clapton's solo made it one of the Beatles' best tunes. It demonstrated to the world that Harrison possessed the same level of brilliance as McCartney and Lennon. However, the band's internal dynamics continued to deteriorate. On 10 January 1969, Harrison reached his breaking point during the Let It Be sessions. He had had enough of the Twickenham Studios rehearsals. After a morning, he was driven over the brink by Yoko Ono's persistent presence, John's distance, and Paul's domineering behavior. He got into a furious quarrel after lunch. "See you around the clubs," he replied as he got to his feet. Then he left. The Beatles made an effort to continue without him. They even made a joke about replacing him with Eric Clapton. However, the band's problem was evident. That afternoon, the studio turned into an odd environment. They jammed in vain. Yoko singing. The Beatles didn't seem like the same band anymore. Harrison went home that same day and wrote Wah. His bandmates were giving him headaches, which was satirized in the title. The pressures and artificial smiles he felt stuck in were blasted by the song. He used it to express that he was tired of the bullshit. In 1970, it was the first song he laid down for his solo album, All Things Must Pass. It was a massive recording. It featured Clapton, Ringo Starr, Badfinger members, and a loud sound that overpowered the Beatles' recollections. His independence and rage were encapsulated in the song. Harrison made demands before rejoining the Beatles. He informed them that they needed to record at Apple Studios and leave Twickenham. He desired a new, more laid-back method of working and an end to the discussion of live performances. The band concurred. Because of his illness, they were able to complete Let It Be and even perform the renowned rooftop concert as their final performance. But the fissures were visible to all. Harrison's demands were the only way for the Beatles to continue. Harrison eventually received the attention he was due later that year. His tune, the first Harrison aside single, was Something. On the Abbey Road album, it held the same record as John Lennon's Come Together. Something was lovely and pure, inspired by his wife, Pattie Boyd. It is the best love song of the last 50 years, according to Frank Sinatra. Both critics and fans concurred. Beside Lennon and McCartney, Harrison had demonstrated that he was a member of the elite. However, tensions continued to rise. Regarding Yoko Ono, Harrison had been truthful from the beginning. He informed her that she gave off a negative aura and had a bad reputation in New York. Harrison said it directly to her face, as John Lennon later acknowledged. Harrison had not been mean. He was expressing what many people believed but were afraid to express. The Beatles' most important rule was broken by Yoko. There are no spouses or girlfriends in the studio. While they worked, she sat next to John and whispered to him. Paul joked about it in an attempt to keep the conversation light. Harrison, however, was more affected. She had altered their relationship and their space. It was all captured in a single, brief instant. Yoko stole a biscuit from Harrison's speaker cabinet during the Abbey Road sessions. He blew up. "What a bitch!" he shouted. Everybody froze. The biscuit wasn't the point. It has to do with limits, respect, and the extent of change. Yoko's presence seemed to Harrison to be the last straw. He wrote in his notebook that he had departed the Beatles on that day in January 1969. It was straightforward, yet it conveyed a lot. He had lost his favorite band. There was no longer the close-knit gang of Liverpool boys. The Beatles were no longer as good as they once were. Saw it plainly despite the others' reluctance to confront it just yet. The subsequent events were equivalent to a dam breaking. George Harrison had waited in silence for years as everyone's attention was drawn to Lennon and McCartney's tunes. He and the others hurried to distribute songs that had been kept hidden when the Beatles ended. People were particularly awed by George's music. He finally revealed to his fans how much he had been keeping to himself. His talent, which had previously been concealed, suddenly became evident. In order to assist George in creating his new music, he invited in Phil Spector. Spector's wall of sound, a multi-layered, lush recording technique that filled every room with music, made him famous. They collaborated on All Things Must Pass, George's solo album. George's straightforward tracks were transformed into huge, impactful tunes by Spector. They added thunderous percussion, choirs, and strings. Members of Badfinger and celebrities like Eric Clapton were included on the record. People realized George was more than just the quiet Beatle when they heard songs like What Is Life and My Sweet Lord. He had discovered who he really was. All Things Must Pass was a triple album and one of the first of its kind when it was released in November 1970. There were over 20 tracks on it. The music was profoundly spiritual, passionate, and rich. It was praised by critics as being superior than a lot of the Beatles' last work. The CD demonstrated to the world that George was a self-made genius. It is still regarded as one of the Beatles' best solo compositions. My Sweet Lord became quite popular. In 1970, it became the first Beatles solo to reach the top of the charts in the United States. But there were problems with its success. George was sued by the publisher of the 1963 hit song He's So Fine, who claimed that George had stolen their music. The judge concluded after years of litigation that George had unintentionally duplicated it. George paid $587,000 to resolve the matter in 1981. Later, in a song titled This Song, he made fun of it. George believed that the message of My Sweet Lord was more important than the case, despite the fact that the entire experience was agonizing. George demonstrated his affection in another way as well. He and Ravi Shankar performed for Bangladesh on August 1, 1971. Madison Square Garden hosted 2 performances in a single day, with 40,000 attendees. That day, they raised almost $250,000, and album and movie sales brought them millions more. It served as the model for subsequent charity concerts like Live Aid and was the first large rock concert. Though his personal life was collapsing, George demonstrated that music had the power to heal the globe. George's involvement with Ringo's wife, Maureen Starkey, surprised his closest friends. In 1965, Maureen and Ringo were married. She now frequently visited George's house in the early 1970s. George's wife, Pattie Boyd, saw them together one evening behind a locked door. George laughed from within as she pounded on the door. He pretended everything was okay when he opened it. According to Pattie, she realized her marriage was over at this point. At a dinner party, things deteriorated. George confessed to Ringo in front of everyone that he was in love with your wife. There was silence in the room. After running, Maureen locked herself in the restroom. Heartbroken, Ringo said, "We'd rather know you than someone we don't." Later, John Lennon compared it to incest. The sense of betrayal was that intense. The Beatles fraternity had fallen apart. George announced his desire for a divorce with Pattie on New Year's Eve, 1974. An agonizing year came to a tragic end. Although Pattie and Ronnie Wood had already begun dating, George's termination of their relationship was extremely painful. In 1977, the divorce was finalized. Following the Beatles, George Harrison's life was a path of dangers, heartache, victories, and near tragedies. He established Dark Horse Records in 1974 in an attempt to realize his goal of promoting up-and-coming artists. He desired to manage his own music while assisting musicians such as Splinter and Ravi Shankar. However, it wasn't simple. The label's initial agreement with A&M Records was terminated. A&M sued Harrison for $10 million and severed their relationship after he missed a crucial album deadline due to hepatitis. This was a major blow. Only Splinter's song cost to find Harrison prevented A&M from spending the $3 million it had previously spent on Dark Horse's musicians. In order to raise $3 million, he mortgaged his cherished property in Friar Park and began making his own films. He quipped that he only did it because he was eager to see the film. The gamble paid well. Approximately the U.S. alone, Life of Brian brought approximately $21 million. Time Bandits and With Nail and I, two of Britain's most beloved cult films, were made by hand. Harrison's audacious move saved British cinema during a period of decline. Even more spectacular was his private life. Harrison met Pattie Boyd on a hard day's night and married her in 1966, but his spiritual pursuits, infidelity, and stardom caused their marriage to fall apart. Boyd captured the heart of his close friend Eric Clapton, who wrote Layla about his desire for her. Boyd's eventual divorce from Harrison in 1977 and subsequent marriage to Clapton in 1979 had the potential to break their friendship. Harrison, on the other hand, went to their wedding and even made a joke about being their husband-in-law. Boyd became the inspiration for songs like Something by Harrison and Layla and Wonderful Tonight by Clapton. In 2024, the letters they wrote to her brought almost $3.06 million, demonstrating the continued fascination in their story. Harrison found it difficult to equal his old colleague's achievement as the years went by. His recordings from the mid-70s didn't sell well or make an impression on critics. He was perceived as the reserved Beatle who had lost his identity. His voice was hoarse from illness and exhaustion during his 1974 tour, and his record Dark Horse was hurried and met with disapproval. Withdrew from the limelight and concentrated on personal and film endeavors. He didn't really get back on track until the Traveling Wilburys in the late 1980s. Harrison's voice never came back to normal. His throat was scarred by years of tension and smoking. His tour in 1974 was very agonizing. He was having trouble singing due to laryngitis, and his detractors were severe. After years of performance, he was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1997. He initially recovered, but in 2001, lung cancer spread to his brain. Harrison maintained his optimism despite his health failing. "I'm not going to die on you folks just yet," he said to his fans. "Yes, I am very fortunate." His 1987 return with Cloud 9 was nothing short of spectacular. Harrison made a comeback with platinum sales and a #1 hit in the U.S. after years off the charts. "I've Got My Attitude on You." He was reintroduced to a new audience with that song, which was a cover of a 1962 R&B hit. Cloud 9 was new and intriguing because of his partnership with Jeff Lynne, demonstrating Harrison's ability to compete in the MTV age. He adopted music videos and When We Were Fab. It turned into a light-hearted, Beatles-inspired success. Harrison joined Bob Dylan, Roy Orbison, Jeff Lynne, and Tom Petty to form the Traveling Wilburys in 1988. Handle with Care, the opening song, was simply too good to pass up. They made a whole album in 10 days, and it was a great hit. Although it was short-lived, the group's combination of friendship and talent produced something enchanting. Harrison remained steadfast in his spiritual convictions. From 1968 until his passing, he was a vegetarian, meditated, and did yoga. He frequently talked about his quest for God and his belief that all religions are a part of the same truth. He maintained his focus on peace in spite of his prominence. On December 30th, 1999, however, the peace was broken. Harrison was stabbed more than 40 times by a man named Michael Abram after he broke into his house. Harrison was on the verge of death when his lung collapsed. Olivia, his wife, used a lamp to ward off the assailant and even grabbed his testicles to stop him. Just in time, the police arrived. Subsequently claimed that as he lay bleeding, he felt his life ebbing away. It was a miracle he lived, according to the doctors. The wounds were not the only scars left by the incident. Harrison, according to Eric Clapton, was never the same. The trauma seemed to shatter the serenity he had so desperately sought, and he became reclusive. Shortly after, his cancer came back. Keith Richards said Harrison was so debilitated after the incident that he was unable to fend off the illness. At the age of 58, Harrison died on November 29, 2001. He passed away peacefully, surrounded by his family and enjoying sitar music. As he had desired, his ashes were dispersed throughout the Ganges River. His parting message was straightforward and accurate. You'd best believe that life is as delicate as a drop of rain on a lotus leaf.